So Churchill said, he wrote once in a book called My Early Life, you must nail your life to a cross of thought or action.
Well, you can either lift up a cross or have one dropped on you.
Yeah.
Right? There's no non-cross option in this world. And that's really worth knowing too. And I tell my audiences that consistently. It's like, you all know perfectly well that your idiot hedonism, your idiot immature hedonism is going to vanish in a puff of smoke at the first sign of trouble. You know that. And you know that it's thin gruel. That's why you're hedonistic and hopeless at the same time. You know that. You need something beyond that. Why? Because life in some ways is unbearable. And so you need something worth bearing to make it bearable. And life is very heavy load. And so that means you have to carry something very heavy to justify it. Now, I see this in the biblical corpus, for example, quite clearly laid out in the story of Abraham, which is a very interesting story. And of course, Abraham is the founder of nations. It's a definition in this story. So the definition is, the spirit of Abraham is the founder of nation. Okay, so what's the story? Well, Abraham is a human being. And that means he's like a natural human being. And that means he's useless and lazy. And if he can have it easy, he will. And so Abraham is like the first case of white privilege. Here's a good joke. He's rich. His parents are rich. And he can just lay around his tent all day and eat peeled grapes and have like beautiful slave women wave palm fronds over him and do nothing. And he does that for like 83 years. And then one day a voice comes to him, right? A spirit. He's inspired by a spirit. And what's the nature of the spirit? Well, it's the spirit that calls him to adventure. And it says to him, get your lazy ass the hell out of the tent. You're made for more than this. And so Abraham, in a great act of faith, abides by the intuition of this spirit. And he leaves his comfortable infancy, right? Because he's an infant. He lives in an infantile utopia. That's right. Well, what do I want? Well, I never want to be hungry and I never want to be thirsty. I never want to be deprived. It's like, well, great. You're an infant sleeping in a crib. You've got infant paradise. Is that what you're made for, right? The mere cessation of your needs. That's your vision of utopia, is it? Well, that was Abraham's vision of utopia. And a counter spirit came along and said, get your lazy ass the hell out of your tent and get out there in the world. And of course, it's a complete catastrophe, right? Like, he faces tyranny and war and the necessary sacrifice of his son and collusion among the aristocrats to steal his wife. And like, it's just a disaster in 10 different directions. But it's an adventure. It's an adventure, right? And so what's life? Is it hedonistic, infantile bliss? This is something Dostoevsky objected to. Or is it a romantic adventure? Well, what do people go watch when they go see a movie? They watch a romantic adventure. Well, why? Because that's what they want in their life. They don't want peace and tranquility and guaranteed basic income and the pleasures of gratified infantile dependence. They want a bloody adventure. And if they don't get a real adventure, they'll take a false one and wreak havoc. And we have no shortage of false adventures in our culture.
So the woke culture and the transgender movement and all these great things that have come upon us so hard, are they going to suppress that for people? You're not going to get to have your adventure. You're going to have
Well, they put forward a false adventure. And the false adventure is wave a placard and save the world. That's right. Look, great. Isn't that wonderful? All you have to do, you know how I stopped getting protesters to my events at university? I held them in the morning.
That's great.
No kidding, eh? I'm the Messiah. Yeah, really? Well, as long as you don't want me to get out of bed before noon. Yeah, so that's the false adventure sold to young kids. It's like, well, the planet's going to hell in a handbasket. That's the claim. It's like, yeah, the planet's always been going to hell in a handbasket, right? The apocalypse is always nigh. And that's because we die and so does everything else. And so, well, the apocalypse is nigh and you can save the world by protesting against those who are at fault. That's what the universities sell young people. Well, it's an adventure, right? They have a messianic urge at that age. And that really never goes away in people in some fundamental sense, but it's particularly acute when late adolescents are trying to catalyze their identity, and the left offers these false adventures. You can be you print out a sign that says, I oppose poverty, as if anyone doesn't, and you wave that around publicly, which is the same as praying in public, right? It's a great sin, and you proclaim your moral virtue, and bang, that's your adventure. And it's a cheap pathway to reputational accomplishment. And part of the reason young guys do it you know perfectly well, is because they're trying to impress young women. And it's kind of, what would you say? There's a surface attraction to being a kind of rebellious quasi-Che Guevara type, and to be taking on, the evil corporations of the world when you're 18, instead of working at 7-Eleven and handing out sugar water to kids.
Do you think that there's something that young people really need that will ultimately redeem them from this? Enough of them, at least, to save the world? Do you think that
They need a burden.
they need a burden?
Absolutely.
And they want one, you're
You
saying.
bet. Absolutely. Well, and you can explain that to them in some ways the way I just explained it. It's like, look, guys, you're going to suffer. And most of them are already suffering, so they know that. It's like, and you want to suffer stupidly too? Because that's even worse. And then do you want to contemplate for a moment what's going to be your arc when the storms come? Well, I can tell you what it is. And you already know this because you've consulted your own conscience. When you're awake at 3 a.m. thinking about what a useless bastard you are, how many sins you have on your conscience, if you're fortunate, there'll be a few of your adventures come to mind where you think, well, I didn't do so bad then. Maybe there's something to me. And so what do people remember when they have those memories? They remember the times when they stepped outside of their narrow selves and took on some bloody responsibility, at least for themselves. And then maybe for someone else too. And then maybe for a lot of other people. And so if you tell young men, look, you're going to find the meaning in your life by adopting maximal responsibility, right? That's going to be extremely difficult because you're so bloody useless. You can't even get your own house in order. And you're going to be called upon not only to get your house in order, but to do that well enough so some woman can stand having you around for more than 15 minutes in the back of a car. And then maybe you're going to have to do it so that you could be a good father to a family and a pillar of the community. And that's not just empty words. Like, if you do that nobly, there'll be something to you. And then when the storms come, you won't be blown over by the first 4-foot wave. And young men think, mean I could be something that wasn't blown over by the first 4-foot wave? You think, oh, well, that's inspiring. Maybe that's worth doing a little work towards it, on the off chance it might be true. And the thing about it is true. So it's not that difficult once you understand it to make a case for it. It's true. And it is also true that you grow in proportion to the weight you take on voluntarily. And it's also true that we have no idea what the upper limit to that is, right? So, you've met remarkable people in your life. People can do remarkable things. And there are inevitably people who took on remarkable burdens. And because they did that, their development was forced by necessity. They were forced by necessity to grow beyond what they were. And who knows what the limit to that is? My sense, and I learned a fair bit of this from Jung, but one of the things I learned from Jung was that salvation, redemption, was an individual enterprise, which is why I'm a psychologist and not a politician, because I believe that to be true. I think that hell is, what would you say, kept at bay one person at a time. And I do believe that people have a divine destiny, let's say, and one of the proper elements of our divine destiny is to keep hell at bay. And you do that as a consequence of your choices as an individual. I also believe that every single individual is in that up to their neck. And I suppose being, what would you say, touched by a spark of divinity, which is, I suppose, what characterizes us. Each of us bears an infinite responsibility. And people need to know that, and that this is no game.
So you have to carry the burden for more than your own sake.
Your sake is indistinguishable from the sake of the totality. You think so that your thoughts can die instead of you. Okay, now this is biologically true. This is what makes human beings different from all other creatures, right? Maybe this is the spark of God in some sense tied to the biology. So the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that generates abstractions, grew out of the motor cortex, which is the part of the brain that enables you to voluntarily sequence your actions. So what thought is the space in which you create avatars of action, right? So what a thought, we think, because we're materialist atheists and we think we're scientists, we think that a thought is a description of the objective nature of the world. And that isn't what a thought is. A thought is it's a microcosmic avatar of you. That's what a thought is. And if it's a stupid thought, then you could act it out. You could embody that avatar and then it would become you. But if it's a faulty avatar and you act it out, then you'll die. Or worse, because there are worse things than dying, you'll end up in something like hell. And so, why think? So that you can generate virtual selves? Then why think critically? So you can kill off the idiot virtual selves before you enact them. Why do that? So you don't die or end up in hell. That's why. So why should you think? So you don't die and end up in hell. How do you learn to think? Well, not by having AI write your damn papers. The reason you're learning to write is because there's no difference between writing and thinking. And the reason you're learning to think is so that you don't, not only so that you don't fall into a pit, but so that you don't pull everyone you love kicking and screaming into the pit with you. You know, we're having an argument in our culture about what's true. It's a deep argument. The scientists say, well, objective truth is true, but that's problematic because objective truth gives us no direction. And the postmodernists say, well, there's no overarching meta-narrative and everything is relative, and they do that to justify their hedonism. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know how to define what's real. And most of us are materialists. The material world is what's real. Here's a different proposition. What's real leads you away from hell. Now that's actually a definition, right? It's a proposition that your life will be conducted most fully if you abide by the dictum that what's real is what leads you away from hell. And you might say, well, why would you assume that hell is real? And I would say, if you were there, you'd think it was real. If you read enough about atrocity and totalitarian catastrophe, you will absolutely walk away from that thinking that hell is real. And then if you have any sense, you'll think, well, whatever I'm going to do in my life, I'm going to do whatever takes me as far away from that as I can possibly get. You know, when this political scandal blew up around me in Canada, people come up to me and they say this, they say, you're so brave. And I think, you don't understand. The difference between you and me is I know what to be properly afraid of, right? And I know that when the cat gets your tongue, you will end up in hell. You lose control of that logos, right? Because that's your capacity for voluntary speech, voluntary thought. You lose that link with the logos, you are headed for hell. And that is definitely worse than death.